Thanks for joining us today for this special episode of Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Senior Managing Editor Dave Noyce, on location in San Diego. We remind you about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a donation as small as $3 a month, you can access transcripts to our podcast, our complete newsletter, and all of our exclusive religion coverage. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. Now for today's special report. This is a war story unlike any other. It's about a fighting force of nearly 500 men who were drafted, in a very real sense, not by the president of their nation, but by the prophet of their faith. Though they were prepared to die for a country they were fleeing, they labored to live for the families they were supporting. Though they were armed and marched for hundreds of miles across hostile territory, they never fired a single shot against their enemy. Though they never tasted death from combat, they endured casualties from foes just as dangerous and deadly: thirst, fatigue, hunger, and sickness. Though they never recorded a military victory, they achieved a triumph perhaps far greater. So why is the Mormon Battalion, a ragtag band of hundreds of reluctant riflemen, along with dozens of women and children, most of whom trekked nearly 2,000 miles from Iowa to Southern California, remembered not only in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but also in the annals of the American experiment? Joining us today to talk about those questions and more is Brent Top, retired professor of church history and doctrine at Brigham Young University, and now the president of the Mormon Battalion Historic Site in San Diego. Brent, thanks for joining us today. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
So, Brent, tell us a little about your background, academic-wise.
Okay, that's a fair question. I started in seminaries and institutes and served in seminaries and institutes as a seminary teacher, institute teacher, and a kind of an administrator for about 10 years, and then BYU asked me to join the church history faculty. Mm-hmm. Now, it's kind of interesting in that I have been a professor of church history and doctrine I retired at like 35 years at BYU and 10 years with the church educational system so a total career of 45 years. So I tell people I'm a church history professor that never taught church history. I mean, I know a little bit, but my area of expertise was more in scripture and doctrine. And so I taught at BYU, and I was called to this position by the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 2 weeks before my official retirement was going to kick in. I had taught my last semester at BYU, and then totally out of the blue, we were called into the church administration building and asked if we would consider taking this position of presiding over the Mormon Battalion Historic Site. And so that's a long answer for how we got here.
So what's your position here? You're president of the site?
Well, that's an interesting thing, and I think it's really important for your listeners to understand. Is about 5 years ago. In fact, if you go back longer than that, anybody that would go to a church historic site more than 5 years ago, they would find that, like if you went to Palmyra or you went to Kirtland or Independence, that the historic site was under the direction of the surrounding mission. And so there was a regular mission president, but then there was a director over that historic site. About 5 years ago, the church historic sites separated from the missionary department, and the historic sites were then their own mission. So I am the mission president / site leader of the Mormon Battalion Historic Site. So that means I am the mission president of all of the missionaries that serve here, and we do the training, all that. But then I am also the site director for the running of the center, of everything that goes on here. And then probably one of the major things that I do is also we are very, very closely connected to Old Town San Diego. So I serve on a lot of the community boards, and the Mormon Battalion plays a very, very significant role in the Old Town community.
Did that change? Because we wrote about that when the change happened between the ministry department and the historic. Did that change the content of what happens at the historic sites?
Well,
to less proselytizing, perhaps.
Absolutely.
More history.
I mean, and I think that was one of the driving forces. And I think the Mormon Battalion historic site played a significant role in that, because our close alignment with Old Town. And I've had many of my non-Latter-day Saint business friends and community leaders that would say that the Mormon Battalion is probably the best historical site and museum that we have in Old Town. And so when it previously was more of a proselytizing visitor center, I think there were people that felt like that there was maybe a bait and switch going on. And so we were instructed, and I think it was very, very good in that it said, we're going to tell the historical story. We are not going to proselytize, but we do not have to back away from evangelizing as people ask questions or want to know what was it that drove these 500 men and women to do that. So it changed the content. Maybe a better way of saying is it changed the emphasis. And we are far more historical driven and really trying to tell the historical story. I really feel, and because of my academic background, that the story can speak for itself. The story of the Mormon Battalion and their faith and their service and sacrifice, I think, is a far greater gospel message. Let that tell the story rather than maybe missionaries holding you hostage until you give referrals.
Yeah. So let's dive into the battalion now, because the Saints were actually at the time, 1840s, they were fleeing Nauvoo, coming west. They were fleeing the United States, is what they were doing. Why did they join the military for this U.S. war with Mexico?
It's a very good question, and I think you've set it up very, very well. This would have been the last thing on their minds to do. There was not a lot of warm feelings for the government of the United States of America. But Brigham Young also knew he didn't have the resources to be able to get all of the saints across the plains. And so for many months prior to their exodus from Nauvoo, and especially as they get into Iowa, Brigham Young has sent a representative who had become a friend of Thomas L. Kane, who becomes a good friend of the Latter-day Saints, a non-Latter-day Saint friend. And Jesse Little was assigned to lobby the United States government. And he got an opportunity, an appointment to visit with the President of the United States, James K. Polk.
Mm-hmm.
And James K. Polk offered to them, Brigham and the others wanted to build roads or set up settlements or things like that could be helping the pioneers as they crossed the plains. I don't think there was any discussion about military. And so that came as kind of a surprise. But clearly, Polk had already kind of started the Mexican War without officially starting it. And that was part of his manifest destiny view of what America should be. And so in order to get that land and to take that from Mexico, he needed to increase his military presence. And so that is when it was offered to Brigham Young that if they could raise a battalion of 500 men to go as a battalion as part of the U.S. Army of the West in their fight against Mexico, that Brigham felt like that the money that could be used that was for the uniforms and their allotment of money, their pay, could be used to help the Saints cross the plains. When Captain James Allen of the Army came into Council Bluffs, when he first came in Garden Grove, I think, and said to the people there, we're here to gather up men to go on the army, no one volunteered. In fact, there was hostility towards it, being insulted that the government that had driven them out is now asking them to defend them, fight for them.
Yes.
And it wasn't until Brigham comes and says to to the saints there, this is an opportunity to help all of us. This is of God, is what he said. And in reality, the story of this is not so much about helping the government or even helping the saints cross the plains, even though that's what happens. I think the real primary motivation and the statement of Brigham Young saying this is of God, this was following the prophet. Ultimately, had Brigham Young said, I need you to join the army to raise funds to help the others come across the plains, it would have still been really tepid response. But when he says, this is of God, then they said, we'll go.
That was my question too, is I mean, they're not conscripted, they could volunteer.
Right.
But in a sense, they were conscripted by Brigham Young.
There's no doubt about it.
Right.
I mean, it was James Allen is trying to conscript them and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
But when Brigham says, this is of God, we need you to do it, they're absolutely right.
What would be the strategic importance of the military to the U.S., of having that presence of the battalion in that area?
No, we want to, as you focus on that, there were really a couple, 2 or 3 primary motivations of the federal government. And of course, James K. Polk is thinking of this is we've got to go and make sure that, one, the British don't fill the vacuum if Mexico leaves. We don't want the Russians to start to fill the vacuum. We want, if we can defeat Mexico, all of that area that was called Upper California, Alta California, which included California up to the Oregon coast, much of Idaho, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, all of that was considered California. And so Polk is thinking of, this is the way I do like a Louisiana purchase, but without having to purchase it. That is the land for manifest destiny. For the military, we were going to build a road. There are trails, and there have been trails from the 18th century of Spanish missionaries and Spanish people coming up from Mexico, but to build a wagon road from St. Louis to California was the primary motivation. And then I think that the third thing is, once you can build a road, a wagon road, which later becomes kind of like one of the super highways to the California gold rush, is once you build that, then you're going to have more and more and more Americans coming into that area. So you have the fulfillment of Polk's view of manifest destiny.
Was it also a way for President Polk to say these Mormons are leaving we want to keep their loyalty somewhat with us? Is that it?
Yeah, there was an element. No doubt about there was an element of that, and I think it's even more profound than just wanting to have their loyalty. We just had a Dr. Garrett Dirkmott come and speak to all of our missionaries, and he was saying, and I thought it was a really great point, is it not only was it to say, well, we're going to get them so we don't have them align with the British or the Russians or even the Mexicans, but I think that was not quite as ulterior motive, was not just to, okay, well, let's keep an eye on the Mormons. It was also, we're booting them out. So yes, we don't want them to align, but this is going to solve a lot of my political problem to not have Mormons coming into areas and tipping the political scale. And so we like to think that Polk and the U.S. Army is doing the saints a favor, which he was, but I really think Polk was not doing them a favor. It was let's get them out of our hair. Let's get them out somewhere where they're not going to bug others. But in the meantime, if they can be a benefit to us, we'll go with that.
So let's do a little census here now. How many men, how many women and children? It may surprise some people. The women and children were with the battalion.
And that, interestingly, Dr. Sherman Fleek, professor at West Point, probably the eminent military historian of the Mormon Battalion, in his book says that having women and children go was one of the stupidest things that a military battalion could do. But in order for Brigham Young to give the word to the saints that this will be of God, he had to negotiate with Captain James Allen, who had been given the responsibility from General Kearney and President Polk to raise the battalion. He had to negotiate and say, one of the ways we can do this is if we allow some of them to bring their wives and children. And James Allen had given that promise. Brigham Young had gotten other concessions from them so that they would stay together. They would have Latter-day Saint military leaders, a lot of those things that really didn't make a ton of military sense. It was essential that Allen gave Brigham those promises, or they would have never volunteered. And so it was trying to get a battalion of 500 men. It was actually short of that. And then you had, I can't remember exactly, 40, 80 women somewhere in that, and some children. In our teaching room here, where we're sitting, you can see that we focus on, I've got pictures of and information about the 5 women that made it all the way to San Diego. Others went back. Captain Philip St. George Cook said, we cannot take the women.
At some point, some of them had
so
to.
We get, to Santa Fe, some even before there, they've got to leave. This is slowing us down. This is not going to work, and we cannot deal with this. So those that were sick and their families went back to Pueblo, and that is called the sick detachment. So that cut the numbers down.
Of men too.
Of men
who were sick,
it was the men that couldn't go any further. And so they went to Pueblo. And so you now have approximately 300, little over 300 men that come from Santa Fe all the way to San Diego. 5 women who were wives of military officers of the battalion. That's what really was kind of the determining factor. If the man went to Pueblo in the sick detachment, the wives and children went as well. But then you had these 5 women, and Sister Melissa Burton Corey, she was feisty. I love Sister Corey. She said, if my husband's going to go, I'm going to go. And he was one of the officers, so she was entitled to go. And they were hired by the Army as laundresses. And so that's, you basically have dropped one third of your whole battalion, and the women, accompanying women and children, are diverted to Pueblo. And so that brings it down to approximately 300 that are going to cross the desert of Arizona, California.
Extreme southern Arizona.
All of the most southern, most desolate, difficult areas. And so then that is, the rest arrived on January 29th, 1847, and that included 5 women.
That was a total of about 6 months then?
Yeah, the actual march from Fort Leavenworth, where they were outfitted, even though they had been recruited at Council Bluffs, was just short of 2,000 miles and took 6 months. Interestingly, we make a big deal of that history, but interestingly, the whole battalion was in San Diego basically only for one night, and then returned and went to Mission San Luis Rey up in Oceanside. And then a few months later, then they assigned Company B to come back to San Diego, and the Company B was here, and the war was basically over. Company B is what we really are celebrating here at this Mormon Battalion historic site because of what they did in San Diego, and it really had no military significance by that time. It was more community service, community building, and they were only here for 3 months and then went on.
And we'll talk a little bit about that too.
Okay.
But okay, this is a battalion,
right,
that never fought a battle.
Never fought any battle.
Is it true that Brigham Young essentially promised that if they were faithful, true, whatever his wording was, that they would never be in a fight?
Absolutely true. And in fact, we find that in many of the journals of the men of the battalion, that they hold on to that prophecy. In their mind, it was prophecy. It was not just Brigham's sales pitch. In their mind and in their journals, they and for the women and families that left behind, they hang on to those words as our security blanket. And there are times on the march when they are wondering, how in the world are we going to get out of this with Brigham's promise, because we're so close to going to battle. And there were a couple of major turning points where one that they Captain Cook and General Kearney wants them to go to Los Angeles, and they were sure they were going to have to fight at that point. They just missed the Battle of San Pasqual by about a week, and that was a terrible battle and inflicted a lot of wounded and dead for the Americans and the Mexicans just about a week before the battalion arrived. And so there was a lot of tension that, hey, we could see this. But they never, ever actually fought in any military skirmish during that 6-month period, other than the Battle of the Bulls.
That was a bull, stampede of bulls.
Yeah, the stampede of wild bulls.
But let's talk a little bit about that. Though they never fought in a battle, that didn't mean they didn't endure hardships or death.
No,
right?
Absolutely.
To talk a little bit about that.
Okay.
How many died?
I think that we have counted about 22, 23 that included some that went in the sick detachment. And so many of them, there were some that died right out of the chute, within the first few weeks of the journey, just died of sickness
from
and
disease.
hardship. Yeah, something that they already were in a weakened condition.
In July.
I mean, you're looking, this is not a battalion of 18-year-old strong Marines. This is a battalion of aged men, as well as clear down to teenagers. And you have everything as far as their physical condition all along. And so there are some that are in a weakened, sickly condition from the very beginning. Then you have some die in the sick detachments. They were under very, very extreme circumstances. Even there, even one of the companies getting there endured something that you would almost say is akin to the handcart pioneers, the Willie handcart pioneer. They were stuck in the winter and trapped and had to be rescued. And so there were hardships like that, even for those that left in the battalion and went into the sick detachment. But the hardships going, as you pointed out, the most southern route through the desert. They talked about going for miles and days without water, and their rations being reduced over and over again because they lost many of their rations on an excursion on a boat, trying to make life easier because their mules were dying carrying these things. So they tried to do it a barge down the river to help get the provisions there sooner, and it capsized and they lost their provisions. They lost everything. So they say, but by the time the 300 get into San Diego, their clothes are completely rags. And in fact, many of the journals speak of them being naked, that they are using the canvas from wagons that have been abandoned along the way to make outer cloaks for themselves, because they are going through the desert where there's going to be heat and lack of water for days and weeks even. And then they also are going to be in the mountains where it's going to be cold. And so they're getting the extremes of the weather, and talking about their mouths. Their mouths were so dry from lack of water that they could not speak. And so there was real terrible hardship, but the journals say marched 18 miles this day or something like that. That I think is one of the incredible stories of the Mormon Battalion, is even under the extreme circumstances, not knowing whether they were going to be in a battle or not, but holding on to the promise that they wouldn't, but they still got to get to California. And And then in those terrible conditions, the story, I think, is a perseverance that they kept putting one foot in front of the other.
What's a favorite story that maybe people haven't heard about?
Well, I don't know. A lot of
You've
people,
already told.
Yeah, I was going to say a lot.
Yeah.
Some of my favorites. Some of the things that are really, really important to me is the Hatch brothers. One of the brothers is named Orrin Hatch, which is a prominent name for us in Utah. But Orrin Hatch and his brother fell along the way because they couldn't go on any further because they had thirst and fatigue and hunger, and the brother went back after they had marched their military march and got to the camp for the day. Then at the end of the day, when they were supposed to go to bed, the brother would go back and find his brother that had collapsed on the trail and carried him back to camp. And that one, very personal, but it was happening over and over again, that the men would walk miles and miles and miles as part of the march. And then they go back to help those that had fallen along the way. Melissa Corey and the women who were laundresses, they speak of helping the men that had fallen and giving them of water. And Melissa Corey tells about having a rock that she found that sucking on a rock would help with the dry mouth that came from not having water. And so Melissa Corey would teach the other men to take a small pebble and put it in your mouth and suck on that so that you could. But the women were almost like Florence Nightingales at times to help the men along the way.
Okay, you've talked a little bit about this, Brent, already, but what's the significance of the battalion in U.S. history?
That, I think, is...
Talk about helping build trails.
Yeah, so that was the first thing with regards to making a wagon trail that is later going to be used, one, by California Gold Rush men, but two, it becomes the foundation and the pathway, and much of the work is done for the Butterfield stagecoach line. And so you now are going to have stagecoaches from St. Louis to California to San Diego to Los Angeles using that wagon trail that the battalion helped forge. That, and then what is now Interstate 8 follows much of the same trail of what the Mormon Battalion and the Butterfield stagecoach did. The other part of U.S. history that most people don't realize, and when we go out into the courtyard here, we have things that represent what the battalion Company B did when they were here in San Diego, but all of the kids make a mad dash to the water, the sluice, because they want to pan for gold. And I always tell visitors when they come is I say, all of these things out here represent what the Mormon Battalion did when they got to California. And then I'll identify the bricks, the welds, the water, all of that represents San Diego. But I said, this has nothing to do with San Diego, but it has everything to do with American history. And that is the Mormon Battalion's role in the discovery of gold in January of 1848 at Sutter's Mill. And that really changes American history. And then so you basically have the Mormon Battalion on their military march, establishing a road from east to west. But when the battalion is discharged from the U.S. Army in July of 1847 from Los Angeles, you have many of them now establishing roads from west to east over the Sierra Nevadas, which becomes the most popular route for the gold miners, the 49ers, when they come. And so the Mormon Battalion played a very significant role in the California Gold Rush. Sutter's Mill is known as the most famous because it's first, but it wasn't necessarily the most productive. One of the most productive gold fields was downstream on the American River that was discovered by a couple of former Mormon Battalion men. And it was so productive, and they started sharing the news with their Mormon Battalion friends and their other Mormons that were in California. And it became known as Mormon Island. And it was one of the most productive gold fields of the California gold rush. And even into the 20th century, people referred to it as Mormon Island.
Now, some of the battalion stays here. Some immediately try to get back to their families.
Yes.
Were they under pressure to do one or the other? Did Brigham Young want them to come back to Utah?
No, that's really good.
Utah?
I think the pressure was that they'd been away from their families, and they didn't want to be in the Army. 82 men re-enlisted, and a lot of them were the single men that maybe didn't have a lot of attachments back to the Vanguard company that had come to Utah. And that was another way that they could help their families back home. But I think the primary driving force was the men wanted to return to their families. They hadn't seen their families in a year. And then really by the time they get back up over the mountains and get into the Salt Lake Valley, it's going to be another 6 months. And so I think the driving force was, I want to get to my family. Now, what happened, and really in your question, what was the driving force? Well, it was actually kind of on the other direction. So the first company that gets into the Salt Lake Valley in October of 1847, they had made a beeline there. They get in, and Brigham is saying to them, hey, if you can't support your families, if you can't support people, we don't want you to come. Now, Sam Brannan has been coming and lobbying Brigham Young to keep on coming to California, and Brigham has said no. And others are saying, hey, it's good things in California, let's stay here. But Brigham then sent word back to the men of the Mormon Battalion and those that of Yerba Buena, which is now San Francisco, saying, unless you can support your family, then stay in California before you come to the Great Basin. And that's why the men were working at Sutter's Fort and Sutter's Mill, is because Brigham had said, do not come to the valley. Those men that did get to the valley early, and even after the gold was discovered, about a third of the men discovered that their families had not made it to the Salt Lake Valley. So they come 2,000 miles to San Diego. Then you go up the coast to Los Angeles. They're discharged. Some of them go up to Monterey, to the San Francisco area. Others come up the valley, and they go up into Sutter's Mill, work, make the money, and then they take their wagons and have to build a wagon road, forge a wagon road across the mountains, the Sierra Nevadas, into the Great Basin. And then they find out their families are not there. And many of them almost immediately left Salt Lake and crossed the plains the other way back to Council Bluffs. So I like to tell people that we say the Mormon Battalion march for the military was about 2,000 miles. But when you think of all of the other that was involved for many of them, it was closer to 5,000 miles.
Oh. So when you took this assignment, what surprised you the most after being here for a while? Or what surprised you the most?
Well, so what surprised me is that this is really a remarkable site, not just for Latter-day Saints, for Latter-day Saint history, but we have been told, the highest percentage of non-Latter-day Saints that come to a historic site of all of the church's historic sites in the country. And you think about it, is because of the crossroads that we have here with Mexico and those that stayed in California and the tourists that are coming to San Diego, I think what surprised me the most was this was not like Nauvoo or Kirtland or Palmyra or the Pennsylvania area, sites down in the Susquehanna, Independence, Winter Quarters. I love them all, and they all have a great story to tell. But this has a story to tell to those that are not Latter-day Saints, because it affects their lives and the expansion of the United States in American history. we have fourth graders coming all the time that are studying California history, and they come to Old Town State Park. They study the Catholic mission system, the 21 missions of California, and they come to the Mormon Battalion because the Mormon Battalion, even maybe not as well known in Latter-day Saint lore, is a significant part of California history as well. And so I love it when people come through, and even I would come through and learn things and say, I didn't know that. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that was this role in California history. I didn't know that John C. Fremont had some connection to the U.S. Army of the West. So I think the diversity of the message, the diversity of the people involved in this story, the indigenous peoples, they were the Kumeyaay people, the Mexicans, the Californios that had been here for generations descending from the Spaniards, and the Americans that come. And I was surprised at how the Mormon Battalion played a significant role in the development of San Diego and the friendships among all of those diverse groups. That, I think, is one of the great stories that needs to be told.
One last question. What can current Latter-day Saints learn from the Mormon Battalion, that whole saga?
I think it goes back to what people can do when they have a commitment to God and they have a conviction that God is asking them to do something that may seem remarkable or difficult or impossible. For me, the story of the Mormon Battalion is one of incredible faith and sacrifice, and then the service that they render not only to the military, even though they didn't have to fight in battles, but the service they rendered to their fellow Latter-day Saints that needed to be able to cross the plains, the service that they rendered to the community of San Diego, which caused the inhabitants of San Diego to petition the military governor saying, please don't let the Mormon Battalion leave, when they had to go and build Fort Moore. Please keep a Mormon Battalion in San Diego because of the friendships that had been done and the love that had been developed. The message is of faith, sacrifice, service, but it's also of how love and service break down the suspicions of others. The military had their preconceptions of what Mormons were like, and they were worried whether they would be loyal. You have the Mexicans and the Californios and the Kumeyaay Indian nation. They had heard these terrible things about Mormons. And the truth of the matter was, through love and service and coexistence, prejudices were broken down. I think that's a great message for all of us. That let's not, as Latter-day Saints, let's not be, as Elder Glenn Pace said many, many years ago, we may be the salt of the earth, but let's not stay as a clump in the cultural hall. I think that the message of the Mormon Battalion was they didn't stay in the army barracks up on the Presidio Hill in Fort Stockton. They were in the community. They were serving. They were developing friendships. And I think we could do a better job of that we not be isolated. For me, if I could just say, here's my personal application or takeaway. You ask about my call and coming down here. This was not anything that any of us would have, my wife or I had dreamed. It was not a good time for us. It was not convenient for our family and our family circumstances. We had some challenges there. I had probably a bad attitude, but I had come. I didn't want to do it, but I'd been called by a prophet of God. You begin to see the Mormon Battalion parallel. I was like the battalion men. I didn't want to do this. This was not what I had planned. And I think of the Mormon Battalion, I've been called by a prophet of God. In my estimation and my trust and my faith, I will go and I will give my best. And I have found, just like the Mormon Battalion found, it's been hard. But I don't have to go through what they went through, but it was hard in a different way. But I every day think I can do one more day, one more step. My family will be blessed. I'm going to give what I can. And just like the Mormon Battalion discovered after the fact that they didn't have to fight a war, and even the road wasn't all that great, and they did some great things, but then the Lord used them in other ways. Brigham Young said, "You will be remembered forever for what you have done and for your families." So the Mormon Battalion, to me, has become the symbol for my life, is that when I have faith, when I am asked to sacrifice, if I serve as I have been called upon to do, the Lord has better things in store for me than what I thought to begin with.
Brent Topp, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Thanks to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind you that you can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.